Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Cybersecurity Recruiter podcast. I'm joined by Justin on this fine Tuesday. How you doing, Justin?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good. Well, welcome to the show, my friend. Nice little chat we were just having before we came on air there. And just for everyone listening, I'll just do you a bit of an intro. Justin, feel free to shout at me after if I get anything wrong or if I make any mistakes or anything. But back in 1993, you were in the U.S. Marines. You then progressed on to be a maths teacher, and then you were then a Garfield County planner and economic development director. You were then a county planner for Garfield County. It was after this that you then progressed into the industry of security. You were a cyber security analyst for Virtual Armor, and you currently are the director of special operations and incident response, and that's for GuardSight, which is a business unit of Iron Bow Technologies. Welcome to the show.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes, and you got all that. I let that be a warning to anybody to update your LinkedIn profile.
It's cool. Look, there's loads to unpack today, Justin, and I think transitioning out the Marines into the commercial world will be an interesting story. The fact you've gone from maths teacher to where you are today at director level within security, that's a big old transition. I think there's a lot that people will be able to learn from you today, and I'm looking forward to getting stuck into things. But how I like to always start, mate, if you can, I know I've done you a bit of an intro, but if you can tell me and the listeners who you are and what you've been up to, my friend, that'd be great.
Yeah, for sure. So maybe I could start the story somewhere in the middle of that local government work I did with planning and economic development work. I enjoyed that work. I enjoyed the people I worked with, of course, but there was an itch there that wasn't being scratched. And it's funny because during that entire time, I was given a lot of flexibility in terms of IT. And I actually just used some of the time that I had to explore things like the Linux operating system, started to play around with networking a little bit. And so while I was working that job in my own time, I was just poking around, and the cyber bug was always there. It was always a thing where I just had an interest in it. And I was at the time in a stable position where I was providing for my family. I had young kids at the time, and as they grew older, I knew it was time to transition into the career I wanted. And I went back to do another master's degree in cybersecurity. And while I was involved in that, I actually was offered a position in the industry even before in fact, I still haven't completed that degree. I don't know that I will, because life moves really fast once you get involved in cyber. Yeah, I got into the industry, and it's just gone incredibly fast ever since then. After Virtual Armor, I moved over to GuardSight, and within a few months of being at GuardSight, I was given some very large responsibilities, and I was a team lead within a year. And then very quickly, just I managed one of our SecOps teams, and then eventually into the role that you announced now, which is our special operations and IR elements, SpecOps and IR for short. And yeah, it's just been a wild ride ever since. And in terms of, I couldn't even begin to list the learning opportunities that are available in cyber, but you just have to, the analogy I've heard, it's like a live wire. You grab a hold of it and you can't let go. And so that's how my journey in cyber has been.
Yeah, cool. It's interesting the way it's like a live wire and you can't let go of it. I've posted about this before, Justin, and Jeff Bezos, Amazon guy. He always goes, "We don't choose our passions; they choose us." And love or hate Jeff Bezos, I think that's such a cool saying because it's so true.
Yes.
Like what you're describing there is exactly that. Something gets hold of you, and you just, if you're anything like me, you get quite obsessive and stuff like that. And I think it's quite a privilege to be in that position, because to wake up with that fire in your belly or to not be able to sleep properly because you're thinking about something. I was going to say, I think 95% of the population do not have those feelings. So I know a
Yeah.
lot of people in security do. So I think we're all pretty lucky, mate, aren't we?
Absolutely.
Cool. We pushed over it there, but you mentioned you had a stable position. You mentioned there little ones, children running about, responsibility, stuff like that. I just want to dive back on that. Was that a bit of a scary transition? You're leaving a stable job to follow your passion in security?
Oh, yeah.
Was it all? Yeah.
No, in fact, the position I was in, it was comfortable. I literally could have stayed in that position for another 20 years. And had retirement, nice pension. I had good benefits. I was comfortable. And yet at the same time, when you do a thing and realize that you're not being challenged in the way you want to be challenged, it gnaws at you. It's in the back of your mind for a while. And eventually, that's a large risk to a family to say, I'm going to roll the dice here. I'm going to move from stable security government work into the private sector where things move very fast and things like acquisitions happen. Fortunately, we haven't had to downsize anybody during this acquisition phase. Those are the kinds of risks that are out there. So yeah, it may sound a bit melodramatic, but it felt like a calling during that time.
I'm just smiling there when you mentioned about different transactions and events and acquisitions in the industry. As a recruiter there, I've had a few painful moments where you go on a life cycle with a company and they get acquired, and guess what? Through no fault of your own, you might not be the selected vendor anymore. Yeah, it is a space that through success, that kind of thing can happen. And you've mentioned there, you mentioned the word comfortable, and we talk about it a lot on the pod about getting comfortable, being uncomfortable and stuff like that. Just what gave you that to push on? Have you got support in the family, or have you got, is it kind of internal conversations you have with yourself or anything like that that the listeners could learn from that can make them follow the same path if they're thinking about maybe doing something, but they're scared at the minute?
Yeah, no, that's a great question because I think it started internally. And I just recognized that I'd always been very curious about technology. One of the things that I didn't list on LinkedIn was a period of time where I worked in, and I think the bug started there. I did a little network administration, a little system administration, but not for a terribly long period. So I had just that interest and that curiosity. And I was always seeing these things in the news. I was always seeing various news items about hackers doing this and getting into various agencies or companies or anything like that. And I was just fascinated. I was like, how do they do that? How does that happen? And the term we use over here at GuardSight and Ironbow is aggressive curiosity. And I just had this aggressive curiosity. It was a driving force. Like, how did they do that? And I was trying to recreate some of that on my own, but I just didn't have the training for it. I didn't have the vocabulary or the technical skills. And so I just realized that, look, I've got to, if I want to understand this world, I've got to put the time into it. So it was a curiosity driven thing. But as well, I know my wife was aware that I was stagnant in my role at work. It was a fine job. Like I said, good people. I still miss some of the people I worked with, but she was very supportive of the fact that she knew I needed a change. And when I started talking about this, she encouraged it. And to her credit, she's somebody who very much likes stability. So for her to recognize that I needed something in my life and to support that was a big deal.
I honestly think it's what makes us feel alive, having that. Yes, it feels a bit scary and create feelings of anxiety and stuff like that, but that feeling of moving forward and pushing yourself and testing yourself. I've seen it over the years with people in my personal life, kind of family, friends, and they've retired and then they've encountered health problems because there's no stimulation going on. Or I've had friends that have sold various businesses and they're adamant they're going to do nothing for years on end, and give it 6 months, they're absolutely down in the dumps and they're back to work because you've got to have that. I think we all think we don't, perhaps now and again, we think we don't want the stress and we don't want the aggravation that comes with it. But I don't know, I think, I know myself, I don't know if you're the same, Justin, I sometimes don't want as much stress, but like it in some ways.
It's funny you'd mention that because it is a thing where it will eat you whole if you let it. This environment, it will consume you entirely. And I noticed in my own self, I don't know if the goal of this podcast is to talk in terms of balanced living and those kinds of things, but maybe if you'll permit me to deviate just a little bit, I noticed those kinds of things to the point where I was not sleeping well at all. I would wake up in the night just thinking about work. And so I had to set limits for myself, set boundaries and say, there's some things that will wait and there were some things that won't happen. And then there are the important things that will happen. And so I had to be willing to let go of some of those curiosities I was always chasing and allow myself to narrow my focus a little bit and then to set boundaries on things, determine the difference between urgent and important, those kinds of things, and just get very good at time management, get very organized, all the things that you hear. But I think I could not continue in this industry if I didn't do those kinds of things.
You can talk about anything you want, mate. You don't need to you talk about what you want, Justin. Don't worry about it, my friend. On a serious note, the balance thing, I'm glad you've brought it up. And one of the reasons I say this not every week, but I've probably said it 4 or 5 times on the show before. One of the reasons I wanted to start the pod is because there's a lot of people out there working remotely, and I show my age a bit now, but when I was progressing in my role, I was in an office, and if you're having a down day or you're worried about something, you could talk about it. And I think there is probably a lot of people out there that are on their own, working remote. And you mentioned they're not sleeping, thinking about work all the time, couldn't quite get that balance living. How, I know you mentioned prioritization, but how did you pull yourself out of that? If I'm listening now thinking, I'm going through that, I'm struggling to sleep, I'm stressed, I'm anxious, I'm worried. How did you get from that point where you were to coming out of it and to feeling good like you are doing now, or hopefully are doing now?
Yes, yeah, I am doing well now. I think some of it was just recognizing that if I wanted to do this long term, if I wanted to be there for my team and for the people I work with, I needed to repair something. Like anything, if you have a server that's misbehaving, you have to put in the time to repair it, to patch it, do those kinds of things. It works with yourself as well. You have to just recognize that fixing that is an essential thing. It's not a thing that will just magically happen. You have to push on it. So in those particular cases, it was a matter of saying, I will devote time and resources to this particular thing, and then I will move on to the next thing. One of the things my boss has always been big on unplugging, getting up, moving around, turning off the technology. We're so glued to our screens and things all the time. So actually getting up and moving away from that, going outside, getting fresh air, drinking a lot of water, these basic kinds of things. But in my particular case, I was willing to actually go see a couple of doctors, identify some areas that were causing me not to sleep well, and practice good sleep hygiene. These are basics, but once it was really about saying, this is a challenge, and I'm going to rise to the challenge. I'm going to defeat this thing. And so it was really about just doing the necessary things until those things improved. It was just saying, this is an obstacle, I'm going to solve it, as opposed to taking a mindset that this is my life now. You can't get in that defeatist attitude. You have to be willing to say, okay, there's corrections I want to make, and I'm going to make them.
Yeah, thanks, mate, and thank you for talking about this, because it will be helping other people, and I think it's good to talk about it, because we all go through these periods, we all have these feelings, and I think maybe not so much these days. I think people are talking about it more on things like this
Mm-hmm.
pod and other shows, and I think it's really good. And by the way, I really like the analogy of repairing to the server, because people listening will relate to that. If you
Right.
just if you keep hammering your hardware, you're going to have to replace your hardware. Well, you can't replace yourself, so you've perhaps got to look
Yeah.
after it. And yeah, it's true. But as well, you mentioned there as well about prioritization. I don't know if you find it, but I'm sure you do. But there is just always something that needs doing, isn't there? You have to have a cut-off point, because I look at my to-do list at the minute, I could just go and go, and you could just never ever stop. So you've got to get good at prioritizing. I'm asking this next question for myself, because I could probably do
Sure.
some tips. How do you prioritize? Any tips there, and how do
Mm-hmm.
you how do you come up with a good cut-off point and stop yourself just from going? How do you get good at that, mate?
Yeah, so I guess two kinds of advice on that. One is I set aside a block of time first thing in the morning. When I come in, I look at. I used to think that I could do this, that it would just magically happen on its own, or that throughout the day I'd spend 5 or 10 minutes here or there. And no, that's actually counterproductive. That will cause you at the beginning of the day. I open an app that I use called Todoist, and I look at everything that I've scheduled for myself for the day. And typically from the outset, I know that there are things that will not get done. And so I look at my calendar in terms of meetings, in terms of things that have come in that are high priority, and I start to push some of those things. So I take some of the things that are there and I say, not today. It's important, but it's not urgent. And I will move it. I will pick a day to move it to. Additionally, I will go through and clean out my inbox. So I will look at the things that are in my email inbox. And again, get rid of things that just, first of all, do I need to do anything with it at all? The answer is no, get rid of it. Is it going to send me off on a rabbit hole researching the latest APT technique? Those kinds of things. Like, okay, have the discipline to limit yourself to research those kinds of things. Like, okay, I'll look at one, but not five or not seven, these kinds of things. Get rid of some of those things and just quickly spend 10, 15 minutes going through those kinds of things and getting a very small inbox, making sure that there's not just things that are weighing on your mind because they're sitting there in your inbox. The number of interfaces I have in terms of things I need to do, it probably is down to three: email, inbox, Todoist, and our own internal ticketing system. So I do oversee a team, and so I do look at the things that are in our inbox, and I not only have to prioritize for myself, but also for my team. So a lot of that, I've got a great team. I match up tasks to skills, and I just assign it out with any commentary I have, and then I don't have to worry about that. Those are the kinds of things that I do. But be willing to come in and get organized first thing every morning, and then make those decisions. Say, is this urgent or important? If it's something I'd like to get done today, I'll leave it in Todoist, recognizing that maybe by the end of the day it won't get done. And at the end of the day, now go through and organize. You want that list to be gone off your mind. You want that to be at zero at the end of the day. So you're going to, again, repeat that process, move things, and then say, my day is done. I am now in a phase where I am detaching from work. Give yourself 30 minutes to say, okay, I'm going to detach. I'm going to clear my head. I'm going to transition from work to not work right now.
Yeah, no, thank you, mate. I really like that. And a word you used, you mentioned the word long term about 10, 15 minutes ago.
Mhm.
And we're all, I'd like to think most of us are all really enjoying what we're doing. And if it's going to be like that for the long term and we're going to do it
Mhm.
long term, I think we've got to be thinking like this. And mate, I'm as guilty as anyone for this. You can just let stuff run away from you and stuff like that. And I think sometimes we know these things sometimes, but we do need them reinforcing. So I think it's good to emphasize them. So that app's called Todoist, did you say? Todoist?
Yes, it's like a to-do list, but with what is that? A glottal stop? I don't know.
Okay. Yeah,
Anyway,
cool.
just drop the L and have a little hiccup when you say it. I don't know.
Yeah, listen, we'll find it and we'll get it in the show notes. So thanks for that,
Mhm.
mate. When you first started at GuardSight, you progressed pretty
Mhm.
quickly. You said you got a lot of responsibility quickly.
Sure.
Did that create any feelings of imposter syndrome? Was it really hard to grasp new things quickly? How did you cope with that?
Great questions. Yeah. So the particular customer I was assigned to at that time, a very large customer, tens of thousands of endpoints. And yeah, initially I came into it and I was doing these deep dives. They have a great setup there where they have central logging server and PCAP server. And so we could go to the source on everything we wanted. And I love that because it allowed me to just take these wonderful deep dives and just understand these logs at a super intimate level. So in terms of the systems that were alerting us to various things, we would get an alert and we could go and just really explore and develop this wonderful deep understanding of how things worked. And that was fine because it was allowing me to feel like I was learning new stuff every day. And then all of a sudden I was put into a response. I became responsible for that particular customer. And all of a sudden it was like, okay, wow, this is very different. And so you talk imposter syndrome. I came into cyber late. And so I was competing with all these young guys and gals who were really, they have those young brains that are
Yeah.
super sharp. And I was having to compete with that. And I did have some confidence coming in as a little bit of an older guy that okay, I've seen a lot of different kinds of things in my life. So I
Mm,
had that confidence, but the imposter syndrome was real. It was real. It was like, okay, these guys are quicker than I am. I'm going to have to devote the time. I'm going to have to be
mm,
patient. And then again, when I was put in a role of responsibility and having to explain things to a customer, when something would come along and they would ask, they would say, okay, should we be worried about this? I had to then be able to articulate our findings in such a way that conveyed what was going on and give them in very short order an understanding of whether they needed to be worried or not. And sometimes that included saying such things as we're monitoring it, we'll have more data. But one of the important things I learned during that, again, just to segue slightly, was that if you give people information up front, if you are the one pushing the information, they trust you much more than if they're having to come get it. That if you reach out to them and say, yeah, we're observing this, this is what we're doing, their response is generally, oh, cool, thank you, as opposed to, what are you guys doing about this alert? Have you seen this alert? They may worry that you haven't seen it, and so to push small amounts of the right information does wonders in terms of setting customers at ease. Let me pivot back quickly to the
mm,
imposter syndrome thing.
mm.
That can pop up at any time. It's interesting. Whenever you change responsibilities, whenever you get in a new environment, different technology, it's wow, I don't know this stuff. And yeah, it is a cyclical thing. You have to recognize that, okay, I'm feeling some fear that I don't know this. What do I need to do to close that gap, close that understanding gap, and then just spend the time, be willing to spend the time again, spend the time and resources to overcome that obstacle. In that particular case, close the gap, close the knowledge gap.
Yeah, thanks, mate. There's a few really good things in there that I just want to touch upon again. So thanks for that, Justin. And on the imposter syndrome thing, and I heard this on another podcast, and it was basically saying, like, you mentioned there, switching task or going on or learning a new skill. If it wasn't called imposter syndrome, if it was called like, oh, I've gone into growth mode again, it's almost like the connotations that we associate with it. We're seeing it as a bit of a kind of scary, potentially negative thing. But if it's almost just, if you're feeling those feelings, it probably means, like you got thrust into a new environment. You were like, your mind and body was like, whoa, I got to grow, I got to learn this, I got to grasp this, and you clearly did. And boom, all of a sudden you've progressed onto director level and so on and so forth. So I think it's a really good thing, and clearly you've handled it well, mate. Just one point I just want to come back onto, just so I'm clear and the listeners are clear. When you're in a scenario, you're giving the information up front. So is it when you're you're in a scenario and perhaps something bad has happened, or perhaps the customer's just, you're really proactively communicating with them, giving them info to essentially increase your levels of service and strengthen the relationship and the trust levels? I
Yeah,
really like that.
in fact, yeah. So I think maybe now is a good time to bring up let's call it the switch. You go from, okay, we're monitoring this, to we need to bring more resources to bear, and that's incident response. Okay, and this is the thing I think in cyber where a lot of people don't understand. If you're an adrenaline junkie, you want to be an IR. Incident response is where it's at, because yes, they're all day, every day. There are alerts that come in, they're triaged, they're nothing. All day, every day, months will go by, sometimes like this. And yet, every once in a while, something comes along and it just doesn't quite fit. You can't explain it away. And I think a lot of people at that point hit this wall that feels a little bit like imposter syndrome, call back to that. But the idea is, okay, what do we do now? What do we do now? And maybe you have procedures in place, but maybe they're in a dusty old manual that nobody's looked at for months, or you look at the date and it's not from this millennium or something like that. And incident response, because of that, is so important, because it is about the ability to transition from one mode to another, to flip that switch into, okay, we're going to bring some people in and their job is to get to the bottom of this, and we're going to operate at a different cadence now. We're going to operate in a different manner. And if people recognize, once you learn that this is a process that can be employed and there are people that are good at it, it really takes a lot of that fear and uncertainty away. That you may experience when you're an analyst seeing alerts come in. If you have a good incident response, not just a plan, incident response plans are important, but an incident response team that knows what they're doing, practices, that's seen a bunch of kinds of attacks, it changes things. And this is, I think, one of the most important things in cyber, is to have the ability to have a team that can respond to whatever scenario comes along.
Mm. Mate, it sounds exciting. I mean, I've never done incident response myself. Just the way you're talking about it, I could tell it's exciting. I bet your communication's got to be really good in those instances, because
Yes.
stress levels are running high, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. And any stories we can learn from that you're allowed to tell, or any anything like that?
Yeah. No, in fact, it was interesting. There was a fairly recent incident, actually, where the customer they were just absolutely blindsided. It hit them hard. They went from no alerts to complete ransomware in a matter of hours. So they knew something bad was going on. They were under a lot of pressure to maintain operations. And we were on a kickoff call with these folks. And I remember the guy saying outright, he's, yeah, I'm going to lose my job over this. And so I had to turn on kind old Uncle Justin mode and put on a little bit of hey, you're going to be fine, man. Don't worry about it. We're going to get through this. This is fine. And it was funny because one of my teammates from Ironbow happened to be on that call. And she later commented, I never realized, but you guys actually have to act as almost counselors or therapists a little bit during these things. And so some of it is that. Some of it is you have to come into it with a very relaxed persona. Okay. You have to be the person that comes in, and you have to balance, in a sense, you have to exude confidence, but also this almost nonchalance, if you will, this idea that, yep, we're going to get to work and things are going to be okay. Yep, it's gonna be a lot of work for the next couple of weeks, and after that, we'll have some lessons for everybody to learn. You guys will be in a much better position than you were. So, getting people in a mindset of everything they're feeling, all this mental spinning, all of this fear of losing jobs, of angry CEOs and so forth, you have to get them to stop thinking that way and start thinking in terms of accomplishing a mission. This is going to suck for a couple of weeks and then life will move on. All right. So you have to just be that. Sometimes the phrase we've used from time to time is sometimes you have to be the adult in the room. You have to be the one to come in and just say, this is the direction we're moving. Don't worry. Things are going to be fine. Let's go. Here are the tasks. And here's what I need. And it is amazing if you come in and describe. We use the phrase sometimes, people running around with their hair on fire, right? People come in, the good idea fairy is all over the place, granting good ideas to everybody, and yet nothing's happening. There's a lot of chatter and nothing is actually happening. So if you step into a situation like that and say, here's what we're going to do, that coalesces all that stuff. And if people still want to talk about it, you find ways to do that. But you take control of the environment. You set up your own communication channels and you say, this is how we're going to communicate. This is how we're going to go about it. And your ideas are noted. We were going to bring a scribe to this fight. The scribe is going to take all your good ideas and they're going to list them there. And those will become courses of action. And now you can let that go. It's out of your head and on some paper, virtual paper, of course. And now we're going to move. Just that human element is so big in incident response. It's hard to overemphasize that.
Justin, thank you, mate. And that's, I can see how everything we've talked about fits in, because the stuff you talked about on your to-do list, the stuff you talked about getting enough sleep, prioritizing the right things, but if all that's all over the place, how are you going to master that? What you've just described there is a real talent and a real skill set, and it's not something that you can just come into a certain type of environment and just bang, turn it on overnight. I'm imagining this is something you've refined over years and years, but I'm also imagining all those other things you mentioned about 10 minutes ago have all got to be done well on a regular basis, or what you've just described just now is going to be 10 times harder if you've not slept and you're feeling all over the place and if you're coming into that incident stressed. That's going to be a problem, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. No, that is a key responsibility to any incident commander, is to be in a position where you have some mental space, some physical energy, some mental energy to bring to something. You can't be, the term I use is red line. You can't be at a red line all the time. If you think in terms of race cars, you can't be at red line and then come in and actually perform. You have to have that capacity and be rested, be aware, be calm. All these things, you have to bring all of that to any fight you get into. And by the way, there's certain jargon we use. Incident response, we call an incident response a mission. We refer to them informally as a fight. You get into a fight, you have to be able to bring a certain amount of that mental, emotional capacity to it, because otherwise you're going to start snapping at each other. You're going to become counterproductive, and a bad situation is going to get so much worse if you don't come in with a little bit of zen ready to go.
Okay, mate. If I ever message you again and you say that I'm dealing with an incident, I'm going to be very nice to you, because it sounds extremely stressful, mate.
Right? They are.
I really like that, and that's a real insight for the listeners, mate. So thank you for that. I just want to go back as well. You mentioned when you first got the additional responsibility with Ironbow and GuardSight, you was responsible for the customer account, and you said all of a sudden I had to be able to articulate findings.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is such a valuable, potentially underrated skill set. It's obviously so important in security, and especially when working in a consulting or a commercial environment. How have you got your ability to articulate findings like you can do now today? How have you got it to where it is now?
That's a great question, because I came from an environment where I was working in government where there's no penalty for word count. It could be long and verbose and flowery, even if you like, and that's fine with folks. One of the things I learned right away, and it was soon after I had been given this responsibility, I sent an email out, and my boss, John McLaughlin, he's an incredibly positive individual, but he also corrects things very early on. So he saw an email that went out and it had some weasel words in it, some qualifying language, and it was verbose. And you write very well. Here's how you're going to change that. And by the way, he only had to tell me that once. After that, I started observing other people's communications, and I was like, okay, yes, you're going to state things in almost a binary fashion. This is the case, this isn't the case. And it's going to be terse. It's going to be, we use a term called bluff, bottom line up front. And I started to write that way. I would take my big long communication and then I would condense that into a paragraph at the top of the email. And I would start it with the acronym BLUF, bluff. I would put that in bold and a colon, and then my paragraph would follow. And then I'd say, if you want more details, keep reading. So these are the kinds of things that I learned via email communications. Spoken communications, again, this is a little different. Everybody you speak to is going to have their own cadence, their own way of understanding. And some of that is now more about the tone in which you communicate, just exuding confidence again. If you are uncertain and somebody picks up on that, they panic. So you come in and you state confidently what you know. This is a thing with spoken communication. It's really hard. By the way, we got, there are, in cybersecurity, there are tremendously bright people and they can write really well. And then you put them on a phone call and suddenly they have no voice. A lot of folks have a much harder time speaking than they do writing and analyzing. So it's a learned skill. A lot of it is, I'm sorry to say, just done by doing. The more you can speak up, the more you can actually be aware of what you're saying, listen to yourself, and find ways to improve. Those are important things in developing that communication skill set. And I think those are the kinds of things that serve me well. I did in previous jobs do a lot of speaking. And so that has served me well. That I did bring that with me to cyber. That is an advantage I had coming in, but it can be developed by anybody, I believe.
Yeah. Thanks for that, buddy. So you were observing other people's communication. So that was internal communication in the organization, or how other people were liaising with your end clients. How did that work?
Yes, just in terms of, there are always communications you're seeing, and generally you're looking at the communications for the content, the thing that is relevant to you as an analyst to go do. You're not reading it in terms of anything aside from that until you have to then start saying, how's this being read? How is my customer reading this? And if I were receiving this, would that encourage me? Would I know what the requests are that I need? Would I have a clear understanding of what was communicated? And because all these communications are going back and forth all the time, I just started to look at them and say, oh, I really like the way this person wrote that. Or I think that person didn't quite capture what he needed to. And so I'm going to be aware of that in myself, in my own writing, that, okay, if I'm sounding like this, that may be confusing, that may be too long. We need to just get the core information across as quickly as possible.
Thanks, buddy. So Justin, the written stuff there, we've covered that quite nicely. The speaking stuff, I think there will be a lot of people listening that you described there. They're great on email, back and forward. They come on a client call and they just freeze. I know that's a big thing in the industry. I know if people can really step it up on the written piece, the communication piece, keep doing what they're doing on the technical side of things, if you can get all three of those things nailed down, there's just no two ways about it. You're going to do very well in security. But if I talk about the speaking piece, how would I get better at that if I'm struggling at that? I know you said doing. I know you said you've done a lot of speaking. Is there any other kind of tips you could give the listeners on that?
Sure. Some of this sounds a little silly, but I'll say it anyway. If you don't sound confident, stand up. Get your microphone in a position where you can actually stand and speak. You sound better standing than sitting if you have a unconfident voice. Okay, stand up, arrange your laptop or whatever you have in such a way that your mic will pick you up well, and do that. Be very aware of filler words and of qualifying language. Probably, maybe, possibly, those are all things listen for. If you have some mates you work with closely and you dare, get them to buzz you whenever you say one of those things. Just make a noise. Oh, buzz. There's a board game people used to play that had a little buzzer. You couldn't say certain words. And if you did, then they would buzz you. It's a great way to get yourself out of that habit. And some of those things are still going to be there, but just reduce those, right? The goal isn't to entirely eliminate filler words because we have to pause and think, but it's to understand how you're coming across when you use those words. Another thing, and that is if you're telling somebody that you know very well and trust, if you were telling a friend something, what do you sound like to them? You sound very different, right? So if you can just channel that confidence, that mentality of these people, doing them a favor, right? I am helping these people, and they are friendly towards me. We have good feelings towards each other, right? These are people that we're being professional with. And if you can just push that mentality of, these are my friends, I'm talking to people I respect and they are interested in what I have to say, that helps you build your confidence and you project that into your words. So some of it is a little technical in terms of looking for different words, but another is finding the right emotion that lets you communicate in a confident manner.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, mate. And I think as well for everyone listening, like getting nervous. I've done it so much and getting a little bit better now because I've done a few of these podcasts. But at first, like I listened back to some of the first ones, I'm like, oh God, it's just like horrendous. And you cringe. And it's like, I think for everyone listening, like if you are struggling, if you've never, it's very rare that you're amazing at something. Look, you might be
Yeah.
really lucky, you might be amazingly talented. The first time you do something, you might be incredible. But if people think back to the first time they did a pen test, or the first time they responded to an incident, or the first time they
Mhm.
led a team, like you're probably not going to be that good at it. And I think it is just, if you're in that position, if you're struggling, you've just got to go into the gym. You've got to push through that barrier. You've got to push through that sweat and that pain and that hurt. And you do come out the other side a better person. You just got to force yourself into it. But we all feel the same and we all have these
Yeah.
feelings. And I think it's just perhaps not spoken about enough. But yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you, Justin. Yeah.
For sure. And if it helps anybody out there, I still can't stand the sound of my own voice recorded. Like, as much as I'm enjoying our conversation, I'm not going to be able to listen to it after the fact because I just can't stand the sound of my own voice, even though people tell me that I present well. You hear one thing from yourself and another thing from other people. And yeah, it's still a thing. So it never entirely goes away. There's still some of that stuff where you're going to feel unconfident or you're not going to like something about the way you do it, but just move past it.
Yeah, no, definitely. And thanks for that, my friend. All right, Justin, I tell you what, I can tell this has been a good episode, mate, because I'm just looking down at my notes and I've not stuck to anything that I said we were going to stick to. We've completely gone we've completely gone off our template, which is a good sign, by the way. It means it's a good, naturally flowing show. So all good. But we talked a lot about comfort zones, transitional periods, and stuff like that. I'm imagining another big transitional period in your life was coming out into the commercial world, out the Marines and stuff
Mhm.
like that. I know there's a lot of people in security that have been on that journey. There'll be people listening to this pod that are on that journey now or going
Mhm.
to be in the future. For those coming out of the forces, the Marines, the Army, whatever it might be,
Mhm.
anything now that you wish you knew back then, mate?
Yeah, I happen to be lucky in that I was able to go to university and become a maths teacher and so forth, and do that just because it was available to me. But I do see a lot of veterans coming out of the services, and we pride ourselves on having the GuardSight unit in Ironbow has about 25% of veterans, and
Cool.
so some organizations are very big on that. There are a lot of resources now that didn't exist back then. There is a nonprofit called Meritorious that actually one of my colleagues runs, and it is all about providing networking opportunities to people who are newly separated from the services or about to separate. And so be aware of those kinds of resources that are out there. One of our great teammates by the name of Ed Neal, he joined us interestingly because he got out of the Marine Corps and did cyber training, and then he put out there on LinkedIn, he's okay, I've done this stuff and now everybody says I need years of experience in order to get in. How do you get your foot in the door? How do you get a job if you can't get a job? And he wasn't complaining. He was really trying to move from that military world into the civilian world. And it just so happened that our boss saw that on LinkedIn, and he sent him a link to our application page.
Brilliant.
And he came in and he's done great work. He's one of our captains in GuardSight now. He leads a team. He's doing great work. And a lot of it is just go after those resources that are there. Believe that there are people who want to hire you. The fact is, if you are a veteran, you bring certain skills to whatever environment that are going to be a benefit for you and for your new team.
Yeah, definitely. I love that story, by the way, because I'm a big advocate for getting yourself out there on wherever it might be, YouTube or LinkedIn. And so he did a post, and John, your boss, reached out, and that the rest is history. I
The
love
rest
that.
is history. Yep, yep. He's been a great hire. And by the way, he came into it again having learned some cyber, but he came in and he was very honest with his technical abilities. Like, I have a ways to go, and he has become incredibly good at that. So he was willing to put in the time. That's one of the things I noticed about a lot of our veterans is they may not have the traditional skill set. They may not have the certs. They may not have these kinds of things, but they will put in the time and the effort to acquire those. These folks come in and they recognize that they're not equipped in the way that some of their coworkers are, but they are not going to let that be their reality for very long.
Definitely. I think there's some like real intangible benefits that come with that as well. Like I just think if you see someone really grafting and putting the time in and going out of their way, I just think you're more inclined to help them out. You want to see them do well. You encourage them. You maybe mentor them a little bit and stuff like that. I just think there's just endless amounts of benefit that come with what you've just described there. I think it's great. Yeah, cool. All right, my friend. So as we kind of edge towards the end there, Justin, in terms of learning material and stuff like that, anything online that you found particularly useful for your career? It could be technical in terms of security. It could be more leadership, whatever. Anything that you found helpful that could help the listeners, mate?
Sure. One of the resources that I've become aware of and have recently subscribed to myself, just because one of my colleagues over on our red team had recommended this. He says he vetted it and he's looked at a lot of different resources, but Hack the Box Academy. A lot of your listeners probably know Hack the Box, and all of us, I think, at some point have played around on Hack the Box and pop boxes and so forth. But Hack the Box Academy, my experience with it so far has been very positive. I've done a couple courses in there. One is just a little refresher Python course for me. Another is that I'm involved in right now is assembly. I did a little assembly back in the day, but assembly language is, if you want to go really deep into computing, you need to know a little assembly at some point. And from there, I'll pivot over. There's a follow-on course that's buffer overflows and whatnot. There's just a tremendous amount of resources in that. I'm really enjoying it. I did opt for the subscription. My employer will cover the cost of that, which is nice. So in terms of cost benefit, it's in the hundreds of dollars versus a SANS course, which is you give them your car and your firstborn or whatever. By the way, SANS courses are great. I'm not being mean, but they're pricey. They're not
Yeah.
affordable for everybody. But some of those resources that are out there. And then another thing I would say is, and maybe this is harder to communicate, I'll see what I can do here. Be willing to try stuff. Learn Docker, for example, and grab a bunch of tools that live in a Docker environment and just play with them. One of the things I've seen, and I was guilty of this in the past myself, which was I would read and read and read, but never put fingers to keyboard. And one of the things that has served me incredibly well is just put hands on keyboard. Be willing to try out some of these tools, play with them, observe, grab network packets and see what's happening. Just put in the time, just have your own little playground, because that gives you a level of intuitive understanding that reading all the articles in the world will never do.
Mm. Yeah, no, definitely, mate. And do you know what I was thinking there? You covered it at the end there, but as you were talking about Hack the Box Academy, like, I'm learning assembly, I'm brushing up on Python, and I was thinking, I wonder if everyone listening would look at someone at director level and think that's what you're doing. But clearly, like, you're still on it, you're still moving forward, you still want to progress. And let's say that is the way to be in security. It's the
Totally.
best way and the way to stay top of the game. So I think it's just nice to hear you give everyone an insight into that, mate. And it's realizing that perhaps there is no destination. It's just a journey, and that's the fun
Yeah.
of it. You just got to keep going and keep learning. It's good. I like it, mate. It's cool.
Yeah, for sure. I'll say this to anybody who's in maybe a leadership role. I think a lot of your listeners who are would understand that it's very easy to start to atrophy in terms of technical skill. You have to keep it up. Otherwise, you will just become a manager. You won't be a leader because you can't go forth and do anymore. You just become somebody who tells people what to do. And make the time for yourself to keep your technical skills sharp if you end up in leadership, because these are perishable skills. They will go away.
Mm. That is so true, and I hear that when I'm speaking to people in the day, and I hear what a frustration that is if they are being led by someone that really does not just not understand, but doesn't make any effort or a real genuine effort to understand it, really doesn't go unnoticed. People want, I think, the amount of additional productivity you get off your team, the respect you get from your team, the what you're doing for your own self-development. I just think it's win-win all round for yourself and for the team. So yeah, cool. Just in mentors, I always like to talk about them on the show. I think we all should be really aware of who we're modeling ourselves on, and mentoring's a massive part of that. What mentors have you had? How have you get one? How have they affected your life and your career growth?
Sure. So I'd say the best example I have is actually founder of GuardSight, John McLaughlin. He's been a tremendous mentor to me, even though I guess when I first started working for him, I didn't view it as a mentor-mentee relationship, but I realized after a while, it was like, it really was. And it was interesting because I don't know that we've ever formally stated that. We've never taken the mentor-mentee pledge. I don't know. Is that a thing? I don't know. But what I noticed is that he was somebody that I could seek advice from, but he also had this standard that we would go and exhaust all the things available to us first. So a lot of autonomy in that regard. So as a mentee, I pushed to the ends of whatever I could do, and then I would start to compile a list of what I had done in terms of the narratives. Okay, here are the things that I've done. And often, when I was ready to take that to John and say, okay, here's what I've done, here's where I'm stuck, right at that moment, I would realize, oh, here's one more thing I haven't done. And I would go, and that was the answer. So by having that relationship where he was very willing to help wherever necessary, but he also expected me to put in the work, that has really defined that relationship that we have, that in terms of our work relationship, that has been a huge thing. And that expectation permeates the GuardSight unit at Ironville.
Yeah, thanks for that. So it made you really accountable as well, because you were like, God,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to go to him unless I've really dotted the I's and crossed the T's kind of thing. So it was like really lifting your own game as well.
Yes, yeah, completely. Which, by the way, I think the gift in that as a mentor that John gave me is the confidence that you have that, hey, I can actually solve a lot more than I believed I could. I have a much greater capacity to solve problems than I ever believed about myself.
Yeah, no, yeah, cool, mate, definitely. And yeah, I think for people listening as well, I think if you are approaching a mentor, that is something for definitely take into account. Because if you are just approaching, and I'm not saying you were, Justin, but for people out there listening, if someone was just approaching and asking questions that they can quickly find out on a quick Google search, it's probably not going to attract a mentor, or make someone want to give up a lot of their time, especially if these people are busy. So yeah, I think a point well mentioned there, my friend. Books, podcasts, my friend, what you're listening to at the minute that's helping you in your career?
3, yourself, your
Ah,
podcast. Yeah, a colleague of mine, Tom Wooten, puts out. These are weekly. They're about 5 minutes. They're pretty short, but just very subject oriented. And then Anti-Siphon, in conjunction with Black Hills, they put on a thing. I'll attend maybe half of those, depending on subject matter that interests me. And actually, we do one internally as well. We every week, and in fact, that happens to be one of my projects right now that I'm handing off to a colleague. But we every week, once a week, we have an hour set aside where somebody presents on a topic, and we do that internally, and we have a good turnout for that. So it's particularly relevant to our work, but it can be pretty broad. We've had people speak on everything from highly technical subjects involving coding to mental health things. It's just a broad range things that interest people. And we've had really some of the best presentations I've ever seen in that weekly meeting. So I'd say 4 resources overall, not just 3.
yeah, no, thanks for that, mate. And do you know what? It's so. I've said this before again on a different episode, but I think the way that the community is. You've talked about mental health there. Like today, we've talked about communication. Obviously, there's endless amounts of technical resources, but I do think that as a community, there's so much good content being shared, and you can really, if you section off what makes a great security professional, communication, technical, keeping your mental health, your physical health, you can really just go through like every section that makes up a successful career and really get good at every aspect. I think there's a lot out there at the minute, and it's good. But yeah, Justin, mate, honestly, mate, really enjoyed this, mate. It's really the bit you were talking there about dealing with an incident and how you've got. But by the way, I can imagine when you were saying it, then I was like, I can imagine you being really good in that scenario. I can literally, I
Well, thank
really,
you.
really can. I really can, mate. And it was really nice to get that insight into how you do it and the skills required and how you've gone about acquiring them. So yeah, thank you, mate. Do you think we've about covered everything there, my friend? Or?
Yeah, it's funny because coming into this, I really thought we'd be talking more incident response that we've seen in particulars, but this has been fun. This has taken a weird direction, and it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, definitely, mate. I've really enjoyed it, mate. Justin, thanks again, my friend. Genuinely, really enjoyed that, mate, and a lot of learnings there. And I'm sure we'll speak soon.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me.